There's absolutely a ton of material in our passage for tonight, which is Matthew 5:13 through 20. Before we begin there, though, I want to give a brief reminder of the setting of the Sermon on the Mount. This is important because the focus changes again in verse 13, where we start, and an important theme is further developed in verse 17, and we should be aware of these. So we need to review the setting and Jesus' audience. So let's go back to Matthew 5, 1 through 2 for that. Seeing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them. Now, first, we need to understand the phrase, his disciples. According to Matthew 4:18 through 22, Jesus had only called 4 named disciples. However, disciples can be a vague term. It doesn't have to refer explicitly to the 12. For example, Luke 6 describes a great number of Jesus' disciples, and also the setting up on the mountain is a figure of speech, and it shouldn't be taken to imply that Jesus and his disciples were isolated. So look at Matthew 15:29 through 30, and if you go there, you'll see the same phrase is used as well, up on the mountain. But the same passage makes clear that Jesus was not inaccessible. Notice it says, he went up on the mountain and sat down there, and great crowds came to him. And see who they brought, the blind, cripples, lame, and so forth. So while some people, like the ones who let the cripple through the roof in Mark 2, went through great trouble to bring the sick and disabled to Jesus, in this context, Jesus appears easily accessible. We can also get a better idea of the role and importance of Jesus' audience from Matthew 7:28 through 29. That's the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And we see there that the crowds were astonished at his teaching. So crowds, in addition to the disciples, were apparently present. Now, some of these people were no doubt part of the crowds that Matthew had described before the sermon began, and that's back in chapter 4, verse 25. So on this basis, we can reasonably infer that the crowds were at least within hearing distance during the sermon, and that's an important point that we'll talk about later on. A couple of other things. Notice that Jesus is sitting down in Matthew 5:1. This is the typical posture for formal teaching, especially from a recognized authority. And we've already seen Jesus' authority as we previewed the crowd's response in Matthew 7:28 through 29. Remember, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. Something else adds to the solemn occasion, and that's in Matthew 5:2. There's an idiom there. Jesus opened his mouth and taught them. Obviously, it's completely unnecessary to say that Jesus opened his mouth to teach them. However, behind this idiom is a Semitism, and the Hebrew is patak et paihu, and in context, it serves to add a solemn or a serious tone to the scene. Really interesting that the same phrase occurs in Psalm 78:2, and that's quoted later on in Matthew 13:35. So it's pretty clear that what Matthew is doing is drawing on a Semitic idiom to heighten the importance of the occasion and really emphasize the importance of what Jesus is about to say. So this was an orderly event in spite of the crowds, and it's set in the context of Jesus' formal teaching. Okay, let's go back to verse 2 one more time, and I'm going to stress this because we see something here that turns up again in an important way in our text tonight. Matthew 5:2. And he opened his mouth and taught them. So, who is the them that Jesus is speaking to? And this is an important question to ask, because if we're going to follow the flow of the sermon and see where the flow of the sermon changes, then we need to ask these types of questions. It's like looking at a river from a high altitude. You don't see all of the twists and turns until you get closer, right there on the riverbank. And so asking these types of questions helps us to see when the sermon changes course. Now, we've already noted the presence of the disciples and the crowds, as well as the formal occasion of the setting that Matthew has telegraphed to us. But notice again how Matthew uses the crowds to emphasize Jesus' authority, not only by telling us how the crowds responded, but by where he places them in the sermon. He begins the sermon by mentioning the crowds and portrays Jesus seated in a place of posture in a place and posture of authority as the teacher. And Matthew ends the sermon by saying the crowds were amazed at his authoritative teaching. So the crowds and Jesus' authority are at the beginning and end of the sermon. In contrast, a group that could be called the disciples, I would suggest, do not need to be explicitly reminded of Jesus' authority, not quite like the crowd does. Not yet, anyway. That comes later. But the crowds are clearly important to Matthew. They're there at the beginning, and they're there at the end. On this basis, I would suggest that we shouldn't draw such a sharp line through Jesus' audience, separating the crowds and the disciples, as some commentators do. I'm proposing that verses 3 through 10, then, were more generally addressed to all listening. Notice the generic statements with third-person plurals. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, etc. The word blessed is fronted, beginning each statement in those verses. However, Jesus, his focus sharpens on the disciples in verse 11, where blessed are those changes to blessed are you. The focus further narrows in verse 12, where he draws a parallel between them and the suffering prophets. And the spotlight on Jesus' disciples shines even brighter in verse 13 and verse 14. See how in those verses, you are is fronted. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. So as we move into our passage tonight, Matthew 5:13 through 20, Jesus is given an ordered scene, or Matthew's given us an ordered scene, and Jesus is there as the authoritative teacher, and the crowds play an important part in emphasizing Jesus' authority. But initially, at least, they fade into the background. But then they reappear after the sermon is over. But for now, Jesus is front and center, and the disciples are in the hot seat. Jesus is speaking directly to them. Matthew 5:13, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Obviously, the main point of Matthew 5:13 is clear. Salt adds flavor and preserves. It's also unnatural for salt to lose its taste, as any chemist among us would attest, just as it's unnatural to hide a lamp under a basket in the following verses. It doesn't make any sense. Now, some have commented that this is rather obscure or pedantic as an interpretation, but honestly, I disagree. I kind of like the unnatural interpretation because, once again, a lit lamp that's covered up in verse 15 doesn't make any sense either. So these things are both unnatural. So the implication then is that it's unnatural for a true disciple of Christ to conceal the salt and light of the gospel. But apart from the general meaning, there are some specific points of interest. So verse 13 again, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste or become foolish, I have on your screen there, become foolish in parentheses, how shall its saltiness be restored? So the word that's translated lost its taste does not occur in any Greek text in the sense of losing taste. So the translation here comes from the context, but the word typically means to make foolish. So Romans 1:22, claiming to be wise, they became fools, and that's the same word. So you also have salt and wisdom closely associated in early Judaism. So Paul, I think, uses this to his advantage in Colossians 4. In verses 5 through 6, he says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of your time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. There it is. So and then he continues so that you might know how to answer each person. Now, of course, salt is not synonymous with wisdom, but as we've seen here, they're closely related. So if we were to ask in application, what does salt losing its flavor look like for us? From the immediate context and meaning of the word become foolish, I would suggest at the very least that it involves failing to walk in godly wisdom in the world. Notice what Paul says again at the beginning of Colossians 4:5. He says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Now, we can apply this perfectly to the scene in Matthew 5:13 because, as we've already discussed, the disciples are in Jesus' inner circle. However, the crowds are apparently listening in, so this would have been an excellent object lesson for the disciples. The people that they were to salt, so to speak, were standing in the general vicinity near the disciples. The disciples were to take the wisdom of the teacher and walk in that wisdom, flavoring the crowds with knowledge of Jesus as they did so. And so it is for us today. We don't have to look very far to find people to salt, so to speak. All right, Matthew 5:14. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. So this transition from salt to light is entirely natural because of the Jewish context. We have preserved in later rabbinic literature, earlier rabbinic tradition, talking about using salt to make your lamp shine brighter. Okay, so this is from Shabbat in the Talmud. There's a ruling that says it is permitted to put a lump of salt in a lamp to make it burn brightly. I have no idea how this works. I took some salt and a match and I went to the sink. I lit the match, I dumped salt on it, and nothing happened. So apparently it's a bit more complex than that. You can have fun with that if you want during lockdown. But anyway, the point is that Jesus' transition from salt in one verse to light and a lamp in the next would have made perfect sense to his hearers, because they likely used some form of salt in their lamps on a regular basis. So it's a very nice transition, though some of that, of course, is lost on us if we don't know the background. There are some possible Old Testament allusions like Isaiah 42:6 and 49:6 that describe light as well, but I'm inclined to think that these aren't specifically in view in the present context, and there are several reasons for this. One of them is that Jesus has not yet mentioned the prophets with respect to himself, so that's kind of a big clue to me, but he's just pointed at them as a comparison for the disciples in verse 12. And there he introduces the prophets in relation to himself, or when he introduces the prophets in relation to himself, the teaching gets a lot more complicated, as we're going to see. But at this point, I think he's just taking it easy on the disciples, and I don't think that Isaiah is particularly in view here. For the city set on a hill, here's a speculation warning. I'm just speculating that this is a city on a hill at night, and this first would be because of the immediate context, which is a discussion of light, and it would be less visible during the day, so it would kind of lessen maybe the impact of the teaching a bit. Second, the contrast between light and darkness is a frequent metaphor in the Gospels, so Matthew 6:22 through 23, for example. Third, the city is on a hill, and that's an appropriate parallel with the lamp on a stand in the next verse. Okay, so they're both elevated. That's just a possibility. Like I said, I'm only submitting that for your consideration. But there are two main points that we can be more certain of. And the first one is that a city on a hill is conspicuous. As the text plainly states, it cannot be hidden. This metaphor implies Jesus' true disciples are distinct from the world. And second, a city in the ancient world on a hill, like Jerusalem was, implies some strength and confidence. So once again, we reflect on this setting, and Jesus' teaching is practical and profound, and even creative, because he, as the light of the world, went up on a mountain, let's call it a hill, and is teaching the disciples using metaphors about light and a city on a hill. Creative stuff. Once again, day-to-day experience is what Jesus is drawing off of to teach his disciples very important truths. Now, as a side note, Jesus' hearers could have also detected some criticism of Rome. I'm not sure about this. Cicero is a Roman academic. He died, I think, in the 1st century BC. But he called Rome the light of the world. So did that make it over to the Holy Land? I don't know. I don't know how widespread his teaching was. But there are some traditions about this in Jewish teaching. So light of the world in Jewish teaching is applied to a range of things, everything from God to Adam, to distinguished rabbis, to the Torah, to Israel, to the temple, to Jerusalem. I mean, it's quite a list. So for Jesus to apply this phrase to his disciples may have struck them as having some very large shoes to fill, but in a completely different context from what they were familiar with. So as I said earlier, the disciples are in the hot seat, or the spotlight, so to speak. I'm going to fit some corny humor in here somewhere. Matthew 5:15, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Now, similar to the elevated imagery of the city on a hill, we have a lamp elevated on a stand in this verse. This point is apparently important since it requires repetition. So clearly, all of these ideas are connected. A true disciple of Jesus is a light in a dark world. The light doesn't just shine, but it's lifted up so that it is to be maximally effective. Matthew 5:16, in the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. So when Jesus says your light, he's talking about our part of the whole. So imagine a single-room house with a lamp, that's alluded to in the previous verse. This would be what many of Jesus' followers lived in. And you have a lamp in the middle of the floor of a single-room house, and it gives light to the whole house, right? But all of the light comes from the same source. Okay, so this is a genitive. We take this as your light of Christ. So I'm thinking now of 2 Corinthians 4 through 5. Listen for all the of statements. The light of the gospel, of the glory of Christ. And Paul continues in that same context. What we proclaim is not ourselves. So this works really well with Matthew 5:16 because the phrase your light makes a very nice parallel with your Father later in the verse, which gives us the reason for putting this into practice, to give glory to God. Or like Paul said, we don't proclaim ourselves. So this applies to the light of the gospel we proclaim and the light of Christ that shines through in our works. Giving glory to ourselves is a caution that applies with everything in the Christian faith, whether it's donating money, helping others out, leading a Bible study, preaching a sermon. None of this is to give glory to the person. Of course, we can think of many megachurch pastors and others who clearly do not satisfy the requirement to give glory to God. It's hard to imagine how when you're flying around in your private jet to going to your mansion that you're doing this for the right reasons. But for us, for the average Christian, I think we need to be aware of smaller and less conspicuous ways that the desire to bring glory to ourselves can creep in almost unnoticed. If we're going to consider the setting as we have, we can't help but comment on the use of Father for God in the theological context of first century Judaism. So obviously this was not unheard of. There are plenty of examples in the Old Testament. But with Jesus came a new intimacy with God as Father, as the frequent use of the word in the Gospels demonstrates. So because of Jesus, the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy, is called Father. And that term occurs just in this sermon alone 16 times. And of course, it's a frequent description for God, a frequent reference for God elsewhere in Matthew and the Gospels. All right, Matthew 5:17 through 18. They read, Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. There are thousands upon thousands of pages of literature on the meaning of these two exceedingly difficult verses. And I'm just going to give you what I'll call minimum interpretation. I'm not trying to provide an interpretation that satisfies everyone, but a minimal interpretation that is relatively secure. So things will get technical by necessity, but we're going to sum up as we go through, all right? So just in introducing these verses, notice the shift in direction of the teaching. Once again, the river that we talked about earlier is changing course. Jesus goes from talking to the disciples to talking about himself. And in doing so, he goes from some relatively straightforward teaching to much more difficult material. So, what accounts for this change in direction of the sermon? Jesus has just mentioned being salt and light for the world. He also mentions good works in verse 16. All of this could easily be confused with the place of works and deeds as others like the Jewish leaders conceived of them. So the disciples were naturally aware of what the Jewish authorities were teaching. And Jesus, both for what he's previously said and what he's about to say, he's going to explain his relationship to the law and the prophets and explain the disciples' relationship to the Hebrew Scriptures and how all this is to be interpreted through his teaching. And we'll see why that's the case as we go through these verses. So one important function of these verses is to establish Jesus' authority, especially with respect to the Jewish leaders. Jesus here is the supreme authority, and some of what he says will no doubt contradict the lesser authorities of his day, as he himself says in verse 20. I mean, he's contradicting the scribes there and Jewish leaders, of course, elsewhere throughout the Gospels. So, given that what Jesus says will differ from other teachers of his day, it's important for him to remind the disciples that he is the supreme authority. And the disciples did not initially need to be reminded, as we discussed earlier, of Jesus' authority. They know, that's why they're following Jesus. But now, Jesus is going to get into some deeper teaching, and they do need to be reminded. And so this is how Jesus does it. We begin with the word abolish in Matthew 5:17. We're not going to discuss this meaning at length, primarily because of time, but I'm just going to say that it's clearly a counterpart to the word fulfill, and we're going to get to that soon. Fulfill is used more in Matthew in context relevant to our verses here, so we'll define abolish in terms of fulfill. Second, we have the law and the prophets. Grouping these two together is a common Jewish idiom for the entire Old Testament. And note, the law can prophesy as well. Okay, this is from Matthew 11:13 and 14. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. If you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. So how can laws prophesy? Well, there are numerous very important ways this happens, but we don't have time to go into them, so I'm just going to leave you with that question to ponder for yourself. Then we have the word abolish again. So notice Jesus says twice that he didn't come to abolish the law, and then gives the reason he did come, to fulfill. Now, on the word fulfill, I have several suggested meanings on your screen, which are in some sense complementary and certainly not mutually exclusive. And the one I prefer is in bold because it's the most complete and I think it fits the best. So here they are. Fulfill, number one, to bring out the full meaning. To bring out the full meaning. Number two, bring to its destined end. And number three, the coming about of what the law and prophets anticipated. And I prefer this definition, the coming about of what the law and the prophets anticipated, because 10 times in Matthew he uses this clause to fulfill what had been spoken by the prophet saying. And I have a couple of examples on your screen from Matthew 1, 4, and 12. So Matthew is clearly saying that the course plotted by the law and the prophets has reached its destination in Jesus in each of these cases. And this interpretation is supported by other passages. We already talked about Matthew 11, 13, and 14. I want to go back to those. For all the prophets and the law prophesied, notice this temporal indicator, until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. There's also a temporal indicator in Galatians 4:4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. So this is a very important point which we're going to return to later. But for now, let's move into verse 18, and then we'll come back and summarize these two verses. So, verse 18, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So verse 18 begins with Jesus' signature phrase, as some commentators call it, truly I say to you. But before that, there's the word for. And this is very important because it's an explanatory conjunction which indicates that verse 18 is exegetically subordinate to verse 17. So that means we interpret verse 18 in light of and in further explanation of verse 17, not the other way around. The next phrase, until heaven and earth pass away, is difficult because is this literal or is it metaphorical? Regardless, John Noland, I think, gives us a good way to understand it. He says, it's a guarantee of permanence to the law until such time as every item on the law's agenda has been achieved, until all that it lays out as God's will for humankind has been accomplished. Now, regarding the word accomplished, I do take this to be a parallel with fulfilled in verse 17, keeping in mind that verse 18 explains verse 17 as indicated by the explanatory conjunction. Now, the meaning of accomplished, in verse 18 then refers to something that has arrived in verse 17. This is further supported by one of the verses we looked at earlier. Let's go back to it. Matthew 1, 22 and 23, I just alluded to this. All this took place, same word as accomplished in Matthew 5:18, to fulfill, same word as in Matthew 5:17, what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. So, if the preceding discussion was more than you want, and you want a summary version, here we go. Here's an interpretive translation of verses 17 through 18, and this incorporates what we've just discussed. So here we go with the interpretive, the expanded translation. Do not think that I have come to annul or do away with the law or the prophets. I have not come to do away with them, but to bring about what the law and the prophets anticipated, to further explain what has just been said, truly I say to you, every item on the law's agenda will be achieved. All of it will come to pass. Now, we're going to return to these verses, but let's move on to our two final ones, and that would be 19 and 20. So, verse 19, like 18, begins with a conjunction that, in context, lets us know that it further explains the thought that was being carried forward from 17 and 18. So this is indicated by the word that the ESV translates, it's also indicated by the word that the ESV translates relaxes. I'm not sure how your translation renders that, but it comes from the same root as abolish in verse 17. So once again, the same ideas from verse 17 are being carried forward and further explained. Okay, Matthew 5:19 through 20. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, first, we have to identify these commandments. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments. What are these commandments? Well, several suggestions have been made, as you have probably already guessed. The word Matthew uses, that's translated commandments, is the Greek word entele. Now, the noun form of this word, which is what we have here, is never used to describe Jesus' words in Matthew. The verb cognate is, which means it would be difficult to restrict these commandments to Jesus' teaching only. Some have suggested a reference to the Ten Commandments. For me, that's not a tenable interpretation, so I'm not going to discuss it any further. And finally, the word these in these commandments never points forward in Matthew. So this rules out a reference only to the verses that follow. So those are some interpretive considerations for you. So I think we're justified in applying our same hermeneutic. As we've said, verse 19 is interpreted in light of 17 and 18. So therefore, out of good hermeneutics and consistency, the phrase, these commandments, must refer to the commandments of the Old Testament scriptures. So, how do these verses function together? Well, I have a summary statement up on your screen, and this is how I'm going to try to sum all of this up for you. Jesus says to obey all the commandments, but he also says that the law and the prophets have reached that to which the scriptures pointed in him. If the law and the prophets pointed to Jesus, then Jesus establishes how we are to understand the continuity of the law in light of his fulfillment of it. A couple of more items for these verses. Some may ask, is Jesus teaching works righteousness or legalism? Very easy to see how someone could just pick up a Bible kind of as a cold reader, read these verses, and ask those questions. The answer is no to both of those. A couple of reasons. First, I've already explained the exegetical relationship to verse 17. This gives us the lens of interpretation, so to speak, whereby we interpret the following two verses. Also, notice in verse 19, whether you relax a commandment or not, you're still in the kingdom of heaven. You'll just be called least or great, respectively. And third, verse 20 refers not just to righteousness, but to the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And for them, their righteousness would consist of literal observance of the law, and of course the extensive development of legislation, which Jesus criticized at its early stage in the Gospels, and we see, of course, something more fully developed later on in Jewish literature and things that we call the Mishnah and the Talmud and so forth. But for Jesus, something more than literal observation of the law is required. Now, we won't talk much more about what that something is because Jesus clarifies that later on in the Sermon on the Mount, so we'll cover those in subsequent weeks. Finally, the question at this point is, what is the relationship of the law and Christianity? And I've already alluded to some answers. There's both continuity and discontinuity. If you want to look at this more, I will just throw some verses out there, some passages that are data points that need to be taken into account. The first would obviously be the following verses, particularly 21 through 48 of Matthew 5. Then also Matthew 7:12 and Matthew 22:40. Another one would be Mark 7:18 through 19. This is where Jesus declares all foods clean. Additionally, Romans 14, 5 through 6, Colossians 2, 16 through 17, Romans 3:21, and of course, it would be Barry Jocelyn did some excellent work on Hebrews, Hebrews 7, 1 to 10, 28, and that's part of the Biblical Monographs series. And he gives a very thorough treatment of the law and the covenant and how they change in light of the advent of Christ. So those are some data points that should be taken into account and some references if you want more information there. So really, on one hand, the questions surrounding these verses can be very complex, but on the other hand, practical day-to-day answers are very simple. Follow Jesus' example. We've done a lot of theology in our exposition tonight by default, by necessity, so let's end with a brief excursus on authority. At the beginning, we went through a long and hopefully not too torturous intro to Matthew's structure of the Sermon on the Mount and how he emphasized Jesus' authority over the occasion. Remember, this included the Semitic idiom. Jesus opened his mouth and spoke. Remember that, the Hebrew idiom that we discussed in the Psalms that shows up later in Matthew. Jesus is seated. Remember, that's the posture of a recognized teacher. He's in an elevated area suitable for teaching. And Matthew uses the crowds to emphasize Jesus' authority. Really cool how he does that. You have the crowds and Jesus' implicit authority at the beginning. Then you have the crowds and Jesus' explicit authority at the end as the crowds come to realize Jesus as an authoritative teacher in contrast to some of their less than authoritative teachers of the day. And then we also saw Jesus' authority again in verse 17 through 20. So Jesus speaks authoritatively because he is the fulfillment of the Hebrew Bible. And when what he says contradicts any other religious leader, Jesus wins. After these observations, I surveyed some literature and was happy to find that there's actually been a lot written on how Matthew uses Jesus' authority and emphasizes it, especially in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. So with this much certain, let's take it a step further. Notice what happens with the disciples and early church, and even, of course, with Jesus in the Gospels, right? Who is against them? It's authorities of some type. Maybe it's the earthly authorities or the authorities, the otherworldly authorities that Paul describes in Ephesians 6. There's opposition, right? So you have Jesus' authority and then later the apostles' authority, and this is juxtaposed with earthly authorities and others who are trying to silence the voices of the early church, and some were silenced with martyrdom, though of course their testimony lives on. So the application to us would be to recall Jesus' authority, even as in our modern day we see authorities who are increasingly hostile to Christianity. However, we have the authority of the gospel of Jesus that we are to proclaim, and we should do so boldly, knowing that we're backed by the authority of the teacher of the Sermon on the Mount. So that's all I have for tonight's study. Just open it up for questions and comments.